Second part is set in England. So this is a kind of meet the girlfriend's parents event, which takes place in a sort of a home county. Rashid has come to London, he's got a scholarship, and he's got his girlfriend Lisa. And she is a sort of human rights activist, and she's taken him home to his parents' house, her parents' house. I think that's all you really need to know for this reading. Lisa's family house had been cushioned and soft, with clocks that had tocked, clucked and whirred into buffered surfaces. Her parents' movements were synchronized around the clock's understated commands and seemed to be conducted in complete isolation from the outside world. The heavy wooden front door automatically locked, click, and was then manually latched after Rashid and Lisa had arrived, and stayed that way until they left. The doorbell never rang, nor did the phone. Close to her parents, Lisa had seemed drunk, or at least very highly caffeinated. Her conversation was jittery and full of show-offy statements and brash confrontation, which was never followed through, but caved into simpering cuddles with her father and a chummy snuggling up of shoulders with her mother in the kitchen. "Will you be getting changed for lunch?" her mother had asked as they stood in the corridor, seemingly unsure how or whether to greet each other. Lisa had chosen to wear one of Rashid's shirts, oldest sweatshirts, climbing boots, jeans, and a checked black and white keffiyeh that they had bought together in Gaza. "No, should I?" "Of course not, dear, not if you don't want to. I was just wondering." Lisa's mother went back into the kitchen, leaving them to her father, who kept leaning forwards on his toes as though the pressure would cause him to omit something of importance every time. "Would you care for something, like, say, a G or tea or sherry, perhaps?" Lisa didn't say whether you are, unless, of course, you would like something soft. That's if you're observant, that is. At this proposition, Lisa's father had braced his hands together at his knuckles and set his mouth in preparation for something truly horrible. "Oh no, he drinks anything," Lisa put in, "everything." Rashid had not spoken and was silently wishing that he was wearing something else, but he had only one pair of smart trousers, which were far too light, and Lisa laughed off a jumper Khalil's mother had given him for London. "You can't wear patterns, Rashid, really, you look like a computer technician or something." And so he had ended up dressed identically to Lisa, but uncomfortable with it. Lisa, however, seemed to be very pleased by how he looked in her parents' house. It was as though she had brought home a particularly gaudy piece of jewellery from a junk shop and could now, against a plain background, appreciate its particular panache. When her parents left the room, she leant over him and kissed his mouth with hers in a pout, her eyes open with an air of hungry sexiness that he felt that she must have copied from a celebrity. The G and teas and wine went to Rashid's head. Lisa's father had grunted with satisfaction each time Rashid accepted another glass, but the food, which interested Rashid far more than the alcohol, was guarded jealously with a foot-long knife sharpened repeatedly at the table, and a fork shaped like a witch's claw. These implements stood between Rashid and the meat and vegetables in the centre of the table. It was not that the meal had made any effort to entice him. It tasted to Rashid as though the whole thing had been rinsed under the cold tap. But he was hungry, and his allocated portion was insufficient. The drink had only stirred up his hunger. It had come far from satiating it. "And what effect will the recent attacks have on your situation?" Lisa's father had asked, as though the question had followed on from a detailed debate when actually it had come from nowhere. When Lisa's father spoke, he focused on a willow tree at the end of the garden, and when he listened, he tipped his head to one side like a security guard receiving commands over an earpiece. "It's a disaster," Rashid said. "We were gaining sympathy for what was happening to us, but now no one is interested. They were trying to make out we're the same as those extremists who have nothing to do with us. No one wants to know what's going on anymore. It's a disaster." Lisa's father had carefully removed a line of fat that curled around the pale meat and moved it to the side of his plate with the tip of his knife to where a twin sliver curled around it, causing Rashid to think of the word spooning that Lisa had taught him. "Yes," his father had said, focusing on the rain moving in the hanging branches of the willow outside the French windows. "I can see that. I can see how that would happen." And with that, Rashid and Lisa's father's contribution to the talk was fulfilled. Talk returned to the regatta, Lisa's habit of driving with the clutch down, the unreliability of the men repairing the central heating, the mouse in the garage, and the office affair of the next-door neighbour, but one. "Daddy's changed," Lisa hugged at Rashid's arm as they crossed the wet lawn after lunch. "Mummy thinks it's losing the house. It belongs to the estate, you see. When he retires, it goes to the next doctor for the village. It's tragic." She stopped at a damp bench that stood in front of a row of pruned laurels that had been cut into the shape of a giant sponge. "You can smoke now," she said, waiting next to Rashid, as though he was a toddler needing to pee. "I didn't bring cigarettes with me." Rashid looked back at the house, which seemed to be watching them with every glinting window. Lisa frowned. "I was born here, you know. Daddy delivered us." He looked with her across the lawn that was panelled with muted green and whitish shade as the sunlight pushed through the clouds and the trees hit it in shafts. There was something of the cross-dresser in that house. The sloppy thatch flopped like a lady's hat, and the climbing roses were like a rouge on its builder's jaw of a brick structure. "I want to show you something," Lisa said, leading him further down the garden, past the weeping willow that trailed over the wet grass and dripped fingers down Rashid's neck. Behind the willow, propped up on bricks at the back, stood a painted gypsy caravan, backed by a row of conifers. The caravan was even more spacious inside than he had expected, with the cosy feel of an underground bunker. The secrets of teenage girls were tucked everywhere, under the cushions and in doll-sized drawers. The smell of damp wood took him back to a time when his family had been in Scandinavia and he had been happy. A stove sat rotund and blackened on the floor. "Are you sure it's safe?" Rashid asked more than once as Lisa leant forward to light it, poking around with a skewer, her straight hair wrapped with the keffiyeh so that it bulged about her head into a round-bottomed W shape. She passed him a packet of cigarettes, her sister's, and they watched the crackles coming off the fire while he smoked. He tried to do better things with her, but found himself snuggled into the warmth of his own sweatshirt, now filled with Lisa, and once there he was pushed into a deep sleep by the alcohol. A boot nudged him into a trench backwards, and he was gone. But even there, in the peeling wooden caravan in Lisa's garden, it had found him. It had winged its way across land and sea, stretched wide, bat-like, its nose conical and tipped, its approach low and precise. It had found its way into him, up the leg of his jeans, over the skin of his chest, and had made its strike in the centre of his brain. After the thud, the windows had burst in and had shattered into frisbees of glass that shot through the room. He could see Aman and his mother fall to the floor, Sabri trying to throw himself from the wheelchair as the glass crashed at the walls, and the room was overwhelmed by a raid of flames. His body jolted, calling for his sister, "Iman!" but his arm hit Lisa in the face. He woke screaming, coughing and crying on the edge of the seat, Lisa holding him tight as though that would prevent him from falling off the bench too. It had taken him a while to remember what the caravan was.